Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 1. These are issues that anyone doing serious study of the psalm is going to have to deal with, and each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 1, the top 3 issues are the grammar of verse 3d, the meaning or the referent of the word judgment in verse 5, and the identity of the person being celebrated in the first half of the psalm. When the psalm says, "Happy is the one," is it referring to anyone and everyone who fits the description, or is it referring specifically to a king? The first of our top exegetical issues in Psalm 1 is the grammar of verse 3d. Verse 3, according to the NIV, says, "That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers." The ESV is slightly different in its translation of the last clause. It says, "In all that he does, he prospers." So where the NIV thinks that the phrase "all that he does" is the subject of the verb prospers, the ESV thinks that the phrase "all that he does" is adverbial, in all that he does. And instead, the subject of the verb prospers is he, that is the person who's being celebrated in this verse. It's a slight difference, but maybe significant. Either the person prospers in all that he does, or all that he does prospers. The NJPS translation then gives us a very different interpretation. "And whatever it produces thrives." In terms of syntax, this translation agrees with the NIV. The subject of the verb is the phrase "all that he does," or in this case, "whatever it produces." But whereas the NIV thinks that this verse is about the person, the NJPS thinks that it is about the tree. Whatever the tree produces thrives. In order to work through the issue and evaluate the different views, we have to look at the Hebrew text. In Hebrew, the last line of verse 3 says, "V'chol asher ya'aseh yatzliach." The verb that gets translated either prospers or thrives is the verb yatzliach, and the phrase translated "all that he does" or "all that it produces" is the phrase "chol asher ya'aseh." The verb ya'aseh in the phrase "chol asher ya'aseh" usually means do, as in a person does something. But it can also mean produce, as in a tree produces something. Look, for example, at Jeremiah 17:8. "He is like a tree planted by water, that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when heat comes, for its leaves remain green, and is not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit." The word translated bear is the same word we have in Psalm 1:3. And the fact that the word is used this way in Jeremiah 17:8 in particular is significant because Psalm 1:3 is probably alluding to this passage in Jeremiah, something that we discuss elsewhere. So there's good reason to think that the verb ya'aseh in Psalm 1:3 could be referring to a tree producing or bearing fruit, though it could also refer to a person doing something. The main verb in verse 3d, the verb yatzliach, is similarly ambiguous. It can refer to the flourishing of a person or to the flourishing of a tree. For example, in Joshua 1:8, we read, "This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous." Here, the same verb that we have in Psalm 1:3d refers to a person making his way prosperous. And by the way, this example is especially significant because Psalm 1 probably alludes to this passage in Joshua, just like it alludes to the passage in Jeremiah. But the word yatzliach, or at least the verbal root tzadeh lamed chet, can also refer to the flourishing of a tree. For example, here's what Ezekiel 17:10 says about a plant. "It has been planted, but will it thrive? Hatitzlach." Here the verb tzalach refers to the flourishing or thriving of a tree that has just been planted, like the tree in Psalm 1. It's important to note, though, that the verb in Ezekiel 17 is in the cow stem, hatitzlach, whereas the verb in our psalm is in the hifil stem, yatzliach. And when we look at all the uses of this verb in the cow and in the hifil, there seems to be a pattern. In the hifil stem, the verb usually, if not always, has a human subject. And when the subject is not human, the verb is usually, if not always, in the cow stem. So in Psalm 1, if the cow stem were used, it would be more likely that the subject is the tree. But the fact that the hifil stem is used in Psalm 1 makes it more likely that the subject is the person. So because the verb is hifil, which usually has a personal subject, the NJPS translation, which identifies the subject as it, does not quite work. And in the same way, the translation of the NIV, which sees the subject as all that he does or whatever they do, does not quite work. Instead, because the verb is hifil, the grammatical subject is probably the person. And so the ESV comes closer to what we think is an accurate understanding of the grammar. In all that he does, he prospers. The subject of the verb prospers, yatzliach, is the person, he. But even the ESV does not quite reflect the grammar as we understand it. Instead of interpreting the phrase all that he does as an adverbial, like the ESV does, in all that he does, he prospers, it's more likely that the phrase all that he does is the direct object of the verb yatzliach. In other words, yatzliach is probably causative. All that he does, he causes to prosper, or he causes all that he does to prosper. If the psalmist wanted to say he prospers in all that he does, then we might have expected a bait preposition, like we find, for example, in a passage in 2 Chronicles. He succeeded, vayatzlach, in everything he undertook, b'chol ma'asehu. But in Psalm 1, in the absence of a bait preposition, it seems more natural to interpret the phrase all that he does as the direct object. The grammar would be similar to what we find, for example, in 2 Chronicles 7:11. All that Solomon had planned to do in the house of the Lord and in his own house, he successfully accomplished. Here is the hifil verb, hitzliach, and the kol phrase, all that he planned to do, is clearly marked as the direct object with the direct object marker. This is also how the grammar works in Joshua 1:8, to which Psalm 1 clearly alludes. For then you shall make your way prosperous. Here the verb hitzliach, tatzliach, is causative, make prosperous, or cause to be prosperous. Accordingly, we would interpret the grammar in Psalm 1:3 as, and he causes everything that he does to prosper, or to flourish. And so we interpret the last line of verse 3 to be about the person who causes everything that he does to prosper or flourish. But at the same time, the fact that these verbs, yatzliach, ya'aseh, the fact that they're associated with trees is no coincidence. As one scholar writes, this line, verse 3d, represents a transition from the figure of the tree to the person who is compared to the tree. But apparently the verbs are chosen so as to carry on the metaphor, for both of them would refer to the tree as well as to the man. And you can see our website for a further discussion of this poetic feature. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation of the grammar on a scale of A to D, A being the highest, D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation an A rating. The second issue in Psalm 1 is the meaning or the referent of the word judgment in verse 5. And this is probably the most important issue in the psalm, the issue that has the most impact on how we understand the message of the psalm. Verse 5a says in Hebrew, Al kein lo yakumu rashaim b'mishpat. As the ESV translates it, therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment. And there is significant debate about what exactly this word, this phrase, in the judgment, refers to. Some have argued that it refers to a local human institution. So, for example, John Goldingay describes it as a gathering assembled to make a decision on some dispute or issue or wrongdoing in the community. In other words, the wicked not standing in the judgment could mean, as another scholar has written, that the wicked hold no weight or influence in the important areas of human society. Where the righteous meet for the pursuit of justice and government, the wicked have no place and are not recognized. The wicked, in other words, will not be allowed to have standing in the local Israelite courtroom. But others argue that the judgment in this verse refers not to a human judgment, something that happens in the Israelite community, but to some decisive future judgment that God is going to bring on the wicked. The Aramaic Targum, for example, translates this phrase as the great day of judgment. And some modern translations make this clear. For example, the NJB translation capitalizes the word judgment. The wicked will not stand firm at the capital J judgment. The GNT, although it doesn't specify whether the judgment is unique or final, it at least makes clear that God is the one doing the judging. Sinners will be condemned by God. And in our view, the evidence from within the psalm itself, interpreted in its literary context, overwhelmingly supports seeing the judgment as a future divine judgment when God separates the righteous and the wicked. In the first place, note that in the Masoretic text, the word judgment has the definite article, b'mishpat, in the judgment. The definite article means that the judgment is identifiable for the reader. perhaps because it refers to a unique coming judgment. Now, to be sure, the fact that the word is definite doesn't mean that it has to refer to a unique divine judgment. It could also be identifiable to the reader if it referred to the local human institution of judgment, because that was something that they would have all been familiar with. For example, Deuteronomy 25:1 says that if there be a controversy between men and they come unto judgment, and that's literally, they come unto the judgment, that the judges may judge them, then they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. So in and of itself, the fact that the word for judgment is definite in our psalm doesn't mean that it refers to a unique coming judgment, but in the context of the psalm, when we look at this verse in its immediate context, look at the surrounding verses, it becomes clear that this is exactly what it's talking about, a coming divine judgment. Note first, for example, the words righteous and wicked that are used in this verse, in verse 5. The wicked, Rushaim, will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous, Tzadikim. In a legal context, which is what we have here, the words righteous and wicked can also mean innocent and guilty. In the Deuteronomy passage we read earlier, it says, if there be a controversy between men and they come unto judgment, that the judges may judge them, then they, that is the judges, shall justify the righteous, Hatzadik, and condemn the wicked, Harasha. Or as the NIV translates it, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. The important thing to note is that the righteous and the wicked, or the innocent and the guilty, are the ones being judged, the ones receiving judgment. And this is important for Psalm 1:5 because those who think that the judgment in this verse is a human institution tend to think that the assembly of the righteous, mentioned here, refers to the group of righteous people who are doing the judging. Sinners will not stand in the assembly of the righteous in the sense that they will not participate in the judgment that the righteous execute. They'll have no place in the important matters of society. But as we've seen from Deuteronomy 25:1, as we see from other passages, it's more likely that the righteous or the innocent are not the agents but the patients of judgment. They're the ones receiving the judgment, and they're called righteous ones or innocent ones because they have been declared by the judge to be in the right, to be innocent. And so all that's to say that the judgment in verse 5 probably doesn't refer to the righteous judging others. It more likely refers to God judging the righteous and the wicked alike, the innocent and the guilty, separating the one from the other. And this interpretation of verse 5 makes really good sense in the wider context of this verse. So the previous verse, verse 4, has said that the wicked are like chaff that the wind drives away. Chaff refers to the husks or outer coverings of grain that are separated from the edible part during threshing and then blown away by the wind during winnowing. In the field, the grain and the chaff grow together, but when the time of harvest comes, they are separated. The grain is kept and stored while the chaff is blown away. And it's based on this image that verse 5 begins, therefore, that is because the wicked are like chaff who are blown away. The wicked will not stand firm in the judgment. The point is not that the wicked are lightweights in society who have no influence. It is instead that they will be separated and removed from the righteous when the judgment comes, just like chaff is separated from grain at the harvest. So the harvest imagery in verse 4 and the logical connector therefore at the beginning of verse 5 make the most sense if we understand the judgment as a reference to God's judgment of the righteous and the wicked. When we come to verse 6, this becomes even more clear. For the Lord watches over the path of the godly, but the path of the wicked leads to destruction. The mention of destruction or coming to an end in this verse suggests that the judgment in the previous verse is a decisive divine act that leads to the end or destruction of wickedness. The wicked will be blown away in the judgment. They'll be removed from the land, and only the righteous will be left, and so the way of the wicked will come to an end. It will be destroyed. Finally, we should note that the canonical position of Psalm 1 also supports this interpretation. In the order of the Hebrew canon, Psalm 1 follows Malachi 3, and Malachi 3 predicts the coming day when the wicked will become like chaff in the judgment. Malachi says, for behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and evildoers will be stubble. The day that is coming shall set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. There are several other parallels between Psalm 1 and Malachi, and we explore these elsewhere. And these numerous parallels make it clear that these texts, Psalm 1 and Malachi 3, were intentionally put right next to each other. And whoever put them right next to each other appears to have understood the judgment in Psalm 1 as referring to the same judgment mentioned in Malachi. That is a coming, decisive judgment of God. So in conclusion, the word judgment in Psalm 1:5 probably refers to divine judgment. That is definite, decisive, and from the perspective of the psalm, in the future. It refers to a future event when the Lord will separate the righteous and the wicked, just as chaff is separated from wheat, and he will remove the wicked from the land. We give this interpretation an A rating. The third issue in Psalm 1 is the identity of the person who is celebrated in the first 3 verses. Psalm 1 begins in Hebrew with the phrase Ashrei Ha'ish. The ESV and others translate this phrase as blessed is the man. They use a singular masculine word to translate Ha'ish, which in Hebrew is singular and grammatically masculine. Other translations keep the singular, but use a more gender-neutral word. The NIV, for example, says, blessed is the one. Other translations use a plural. The NRSV, for example, has happy are those. Now, how you translate this phrase, whether you use a plural or a singular, or masculine or gender-neutral word, depends in part on how you understand the identity of the person, the ha'ish, described in this verse. Is this person a specific individual, maybe a king, as some have argued? Or is this person just a typical righteous person, representative of anyone who rejects wickedness and meditates on God's instruction? This issue not only affects how we translate Ha'ish in verse 1, it also affects how we understand the entire psalm. Now, there are some good reasons for seeing the man or the person in verse 1 as a king. At the very least, there are good reasons for saying that this person has a royal profile. For example, the person is compared in verse 3 to a tree. And in the ancient world, trees sometimes had associations with kings. So for example, in Daniel 4, King Nebuchadnezzar is depicted as a massive tree that provides shelter and food to all kinds of creatures. In Psalm 52, King David is depicted as a flourishing olive tree in God's house. A Sumerian hymn addressed to King Shulgi compares him to a strong tree planted by the side of a watercourse. Also, according to the book of Deuteronomy, the king's job was to meditate on the Lord's instruction. Deuteronomy 17 says, "And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them." This is exactly what the person in Psalm 1 does. He meditates on the Lord's law or the Lord's instruction day and night. Finally, when we read Psalm 1 in the context of Psalms 1 and 2, the royal profile of the person in Psalm 1 becomes even more clear. Psalm 2, which is in many ways parallel to Psalm 1, is about a king whom the Lord places on Mount Zion and to whom he gives success. The description of the king in Psalm 2 is very similar to what we find in Psalm 1, where the Lord plants the blessed person in his garden and gives him success in all that he does. There's a clear parallel between the man of Psalm 1 and the king of Psalm 2. And yet, when we read Psalm 1 by itself, as an isolated poem, before we come to Psalm 2, there are good reasons for seeing the man, the Ish in verse 1, as a typical righteous person. That is, seeing him as a literary representation of anyone who fits the description in these verses, and not a king in particular. First, we should note that similar blessings in the Bible usually apply to people generally, even if a masculine singular noun is used. So for example, Psalm 32 begins, "Blessed Ashrei," blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. Or look at this verse from Psalm 34. "Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him." In these blessings, very similar to what we find in Psalm 1, the psalmist uses masculine singular nouns as a way of referring to anyone and everyone who fits the description given in the blessing. The use of masculine singular is a literary convention, and by itself does not imply that the author is referring to a unique individual. Also, when we look at Psalm 1 as a whole, there seems to be a close connection between the grammatically singular person in verses 1 to 3 and the plural righteous in verses 5 to 6. The psalm is structured with two parts and a conclusion. The first part, verses 1 to 3, is about the blessed person, and the second part, verses 4 to 5, is about the wicked. And verse 6 is a summary statement that grounds the whole psalm. The first half of verse 6 is about the righteous plural, and it corresponds to the first part of the psalm, verses 1 to 3. The second half of verse 6 is about the wicked, and it corresponds to the second part of the psalm, verses 4 to 5. And so implicitly, there seems to be an identification of the blessed person in verses 1 to 3 with the group of righteous people in verse 6a. So how can we best account for all of this evidence? If the man is a king, then how do we account for the connection between verse 6a and verses 1 to 3? And if the man is a literary representation of anyone who fits the description, a typical righteous person, then how do we account for the royal associations? Well, we've taken a both-and approach to this issue. Whether or not you see a king in Psalm 1 depends on whether you read Psalm 1 as an isolated poem or in its canonical context, next to Psalm 2. When we read Psalm 1 by itself, the psalm makes the most sense if we understand the one, the man, as referring to a typical righteous person, perhaps with a subtle royal profile for this person. But when we read Psalm 1 in parallel with Psalm 2, the royal profile of this person in Psalm 1 is amplified, and the identity of the person is clarified and sharpened, such that the person should be understood as a king, the Lord's anointed. And so it depends on how you choose to read the psalm, whether as an isolated poem or together with Psalm 2. There are different levels of meaning. And because our materials are mostly focused on reading the Psalms as individual poems, our interpretation of Psalm 1 identifies the person as a typical righteous person. We give this view a C rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. Clarifying the grammar of verse 3d helps us to see this line as a climactic summary statement about the person's success, and not, for example, another statement about the tree. At the same time, as we looked at this issue, we were able to uncover a significant poetic feature. That is, even though the line primarily refers to the person, the poet has chosen words that also have strong associations with trees. The meaning of judgment in verse 5 is crucial for understanding Psalm 1. Psalm 1 appears to assume a situation in which the righteous and the wicked are living together, like grain and chaff growing together in a field. And there's no clear distinction. There's no clear reward for the righteous or punishment for the wicked. And so people are questioning whether following the Lord's instruction is really worth it. This is exactly the situation that Malachi describes at the end of his prophecy. Psalm 1 is a response to this situation. It reminds us that the time of harvest is coming. There will be a day when the Lord separates the righteous and the wicked, when the wicked will be blown away like chaff, when the way of the wicked will come to an end. Finally, the question of the identity of the person in Psalm 1 led us to see how Psalm 1 takes on a deeper meaning when it's read alongside Psalm 2. When considered as an individual poem, the person in Psalm 1 appears to be a typical righteous person, and the psalm is an implicit exhortation to become like this person. But when we read Psalm 1 together with Psalm 2, this person emerges more clearly as a king. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 1, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. All of our videos are offered free of charge, thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at Scriptura.org to learn more.